There are moments that don't explode. They don't make headlines. They don't echo through history. They wait. One unanswered phone call. One decision made through silence. One voice that never came back. This is the story of the night Elvis Presley let the phone ring and carried the weight of that choice longer than anyone ever knew. Stay until the end, because this isn't about what was said. It's about what never was. The phone rang once. Elvis was sitting alone, the room dim, the air thick with the kind of quiet that made small sounds feel intrusive. He hadn't been expecting a call. At that hour, most people knew better. The ring cut through the stillness like a blade. He didn't move. The phone rang again. Elvis stared at it from across the room, its black shape heavy with possibility. Calls always meant something. Demands. Expectations. Emergencies disguised as urgency. He had learned to brace himself before answering. The third ring echoed longer than the others, as if the sound itself were asking for permission to continue. Elvis exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. He told himself he was tired, that he'd answer if it rang again, that whoever was would call back. The phone stopped. Silence rushed in to fill the space, louder now than the ringing had been. Elvis felt a subtle tightening in his chest. Not alarm, not fear, recognition. He knew who it was, not with certainty, but with instinct, the kind that doesn't need proof to feel heavy. Someone from a part of his life he didn't visit often anymore. Someone whose calls carried history instead of convenience. Elvis stood and crossed the room, picking up the receiver slowly, listening to the deadline. No voice, no message, just the absence. He set the phone down carefully, as if rough movement might change something. It didn't. He told himself it wasn't the right time. That conversations like that required energy he didn't have tonight. That silence was sometimes kinder than half-presence. Those explanations felt reasonable. Too reasonable. Elvis walked to the window and looked out into the night. The street was quiet, ordinary, indifferent. Somewhere else, someone was waiting, or had been. He didn't know what they wanted to say. That was part of the problem. The unknown pressed harder than any certainty could have. Words unspoken tend to grow heavier, not lighter, with time. Elvis felt a familiar tension rise. The tension between responsibility and avoidance. Between knowing something mattered and choosing not to touch it because the cost felt unclear. He had made choices like this before. Most of them hadn't mattered. This one did. He sensed it without understanding why. Elvis returned to his chair and sat down again, hands resting on his thighs, staring at nothing in particular. The night didn't move forward. It hovered. He waited for the phone to ring again. It didn't. Minutes passed. Then more. The silence settled into something final, something that didn't ask anymore. Elvis felt a subtle shift, the moment when a choice stops being reversible. He hadn't said no. He had said nothing. And sometimes, nothing carries the most consequence. As the night deepened around him, Elvis realized he would remember this moment. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. The call ended. The silence stayed. Elvis didn't learn the truth that night. That would have been easier. Instead, the knowledge arrived later, quietly, without drama, the way consequences usually do. Not as a revelation, but as a detail mentioned too casually to be undone. It happened the next afternoon. Elvis was sitting through a routine conversation, half listening, his attention drifting the way it often did when nothing urgent was being said. Someone mentioned a name in passing, a small update, an afterthought. He tried calling you last night. The words landed with more weight than the speaker intended. Elvis didn't react. His face remained still, his posture unchanged. Years of control made it easy to hide what moved beneath the surface. But something inside him tightened. Last night, he asked calmly, as if asking about the weather. The answer came without hesitation. Yes, he said. He tried a few times. A few times. Elvis nodded once, slow and deliberate, signaling the conversation could move on. And it did. The moment passed for everyone else. It didn't pass for him. The name echoed quietly after the room emptied, filling the space where certainty had lived just hours earlier. He hadn't known for sure who had been calling. Now he did, and that knowledge changed everything. This wasn't a business call. This wasn't an obligation. This wasn't something that could be answered later without consequence. This was someone who never called without reason. Elvis sat alone afterward, replaying the sound of the phone in his head. Each ring now carried context. Each pause between them felt deliberate. Had there been urgency in the timing? Had something been wrong? Had the call been an attempt to say something that couldn't wait? The questions multiplied without answers. Elvis told himself there would be another chance, that if it mattered enough, the phone would ring again, that people didn't disappear because of one missed call. But doubt crept in, because deep down he knew that sometimes people only reach out once, not because they don't care enough to try again, but because the effort itself costs more than they're willing to risk. Elvis stood and walked slowly, the familiar space around him offering no comfort now. The silence he'd chosen the night before felt heavier in daylight. He hadn't ignored the call out of indifference. He had ignored it out of hesitation. And hesitation, he was realizing, carried its own kind of cruelty. Elvis wondered what the voice on the other end had sounded like when the call went unanswered, whether there had been frustration, disappointment, or simply acceptance. That thought settled uncomfortably in his chest, because acceptance, once reached, rarely reverses. He considered calling back immediately. The phone was right there, the number known by heart. His hand hovered near it. Then he stopped. What would he say? I was tired, felt thin. I wasn't ready, felt selfish. I didn't know was no longer true. Elvis realized then that the moment had changed. Whatever had prompted the call now lived in the past. Calling back wouldn't restore it. It would only acknowledge the gap. That gap was a cost. He sat down again, feeling the weight of the choice he hadn't realized he was making. Silence wasn't neutral. It shaped outcomes just as surely as words did. Elvis didn't call back that day. Not because he didn't care. Because care sometimes makes things harder to touch, not easier. As the evening approached, Elvis carried the knowledge quietly, the way he carried most things. He didn't share it. He didn't dramatize it. But he felt it. The call he hadn't answered now had a name. And that name would stay with him longer than the sound of the phone ever did. Elvis told himself he was giving it time. Time to think. Time to find the right words. Time to approach the conversation without making it worse. Waiting felt responsible. It felt mature. But as the hours stretched into another day, Elvis began to understand something uncomfortable. Waiting wasn't neutral anymore. It was no longer a pause between actions. It was the action. The phone stayed silent. Not because the line was dead, but because the moment that had prompted the call was slipping farther away with every hour he let pass. Elvis felt it in small ways. The urgency he imagined the voice on the other end dulled into uncertainty. The clarity he thought he'd need before calling back blurred into hesitation. He replayed possible conversations in his head, each one ending with the same unresolved weight. There was no version of the call that didn't reopen something he had spent years keeping carefully closed. And yet, keeping it closed now felt like avoidance disguised as caution. Elvis paced the room, then stopped. He sat, then stood again. The physical restlessness mirrored something internal, a tension between responsibility and fear that he knew all too well. He had always been good at showing up when the role was clear, when expectations were written, when the outcome could be managed. This was different. This was personal. The call hadn't been about obligation. It hadn't been about business or control or image. It had been about connection. The kind that doesn't announce itself and doesn't offer protection if mishandled. That was what scared him. Elvis realized then that the reason he hadn't answered wasn't exhaustion or timing. It was vulnerability. Answering would have meant stepping into a space where he couldn't perform his way out, where he couldn't manage perception or soften impact, where he would have had to respond as himself, not as the version people expected. The silence outside the phone felt louder now, heavier with implication. Every minute that passed made the call back feel less like a response and more like a reopening. Elvis sat down again, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He wondered how many times in his life he had done this, delayed, deferred, waited, until choice disguised itself as circumstance. probably more than he wanted to admit. He picked up the receiver once, just to feel its weight. The line was still clear, still open, but the moment wasn't. Elvis set it back down gently. The realization hit him with quiet force. By waiting, he had chosen distance. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but decisively. And distance, once chosen, doesn't announce when it becomes permanent. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, letting the understanding settle. This wasn't about regret yet. It was about recognition. He had crossed a line without stepping over it. And the night he had let the phone ring had now become a boundary, one he wasn't sure how to undo. The decision to call back didn't arrive with confidence. It arrived with fatigue. Elvis stood in the quiet room late that night, staring at the phone as if it might move on its own. The hesitation that had protected him for days had finally worn thin, replaced by something heavier, the sense that avoiding the call was now costing more than making it. He lifted the receiver slowly. The dial tone sounded ordinary, indifferent. Elvis held it to his ear for a moment longer than necessary, as if listening for something beneath the sound. A signal, a warning, permission. None came. He dialed a number from memory, his fingers steady despite the tension settling in his chest. Each click of the rotary felt deliberate, irreversible. The line rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Elvis waited, his breath shallow now, awareness narrowed to the sound in his ear. This was the moment he had postponed, rehearsed, avoided. It didn't answer. The ringing stopped, replaced by silence again, not the kind he'd chosen, but the kind that answers back. Elvis lowered the receiver slowly, resting it against his shoulder as if that might soften the impact. He hadn't expected relief, but he hadn't expected this either. Finality. He didn't try again. Something told him not to. Calling twice would have been persistence. Calling again now would have been intrusion. Whatever space had existed between them had shifted. Not dramatically, but decisively. Elvis sat down, the receiver still in his hand, listening to the quiet around him. The house felt unchanged. The world outside moved on without noticing. Only he felt the difference. He realized then that silence doesn't just delay conversations. It reshapes them. Whatever the call had been meant to say now belonged to memory instead of exchange. The words were no longer waiting to be spoken. They were sealed inside the moment that had passed. Elvis felt a subtle ache settle in his chest, not sharp enough to demand reaction, but persistent enough to remain. This wasn't regret yet. It was understanding. He understood now that some connections don't survive delay, not because they're fragile, but because timing is part of their meaning. He placed the receiver back on the phone carefully, as if the object itself deserved respect for having carried something important. Then he stood and walked away, not dramatically, not angrily, just accepting what had shifted. Elvis knew he would think about this again, later, when time had put distance between the choice and its consequence. But in this moment, all he could do was acknowledge what had happened. He had reached out, and silence had answered. That answer didn't accuse him. It didn't explain itself. It simply existed, and Elvis would have to live with it. Elvis didn't learn the truth from a confession. There was no dramatic moment, no tearful explanation. It came the way most painful truths do, indirectly, through a fragment of conversation that wasn't meant to land the way it did. Days later, someone mentioned it quietly, not as news, not as gossip, just a detail folded into a larger story. He wasn't doing well that night, the voice said. That's why he tried calling. Elvis didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, didn't react, but something inside him went still. That night, the words rearranged the memory instantly. The ringing phone, the hesitation, the silence he had chosen because he believed there would be time. There hadn't been. Elvis felt the weight of that understanding press into him slowly, not as shock, but as gravity. He replayed the night again, not the sound of the phone this time, but the space around it, the quiet he had mistaken for safety, the calm he had mistaken for control. The call hadn't been casual. It hadn't been routine. It had been an attempt. Elvis realized then that the call hadn't been about conversation. It had been about connection, a reaching out not because answers were needed, but because presence was. And he hadn't been there. The truth didn't accuse him. That was worse. It simply existed, immovable, indifferent to explanation. He hadn't known, but he also hadn't answered. Both were true. Elvis sat alone later that evening, the memory reshaped by what he now understood. He wondered what had been on the other end of the line. Fear, hesitation, hope, or simply the need to hear a familiar voice before something changed. He would never know, and that was the part that stayed. Not guilt, not self-blame, uncertainty. The unanswered question that couldn't be corrected by apology or explanation. Elvis realized that silence didn't just close doors. It locked them. He hadn't intended to walk away from that moment. He hadn't chosen absence consciously. But intention didn't change outcome. He thought about all the times he had told himself that waiting was a responsible choice. That timing mattered. That space was sometimes kin to an intrusion. Those ideas still made sense. But now they carried an asterisk. Because sometimes the cost of waiting isn't visible until it's already been paid. Elvis understood then that the call had marked a boundary in his life. Not between himself and someone else, but between who he believed he was and who he had been in that moment. He had always thought of himself as present, as available when it truly mattered. This moment challenged that belief. And beliefs, once cracked, don't shatter loudly. They settle. Elvis didn't speak about it to anyone. He didn't turn it into a story or a lesson. He carried it quietly, letting it reshape his understanding of responsibility in ways no one else could see. The call had been missed, but the impact had not. Time moved forward. It always did. Elvis returned to routine, to work, to the familiar rhythm of days that asked things of him without caring what he carried inside. On the surface, nothing had changed, but he noticed something subtle. He answered the phone more often now, not urgently, not compulsively, deliberately, not because every call mattered, but because he had learned that you don't always know which one will until it's too late. He became more attentive to moments of hesitation, more aware of the difference between needing space and avoiding discomfort. He learned to recognize when silence was protection and when it was escape. The memory of the unanswered call stayed with him, not as punishment, but as calibration, a reminder. Elvis didn't romanticize it. He didn't turn it into tragedy. He accepted it as something that had happened, something that couldn't be revised, only integrated. Some nights, the memory surfaced without warning. Not the sound of the phone, but the stillness afterward. The moment when choice hardened into consequence. He didn't fight it. He let it pass. Because carrying it didn't mean being consumed by it. It meant allowing it to inform him. Elvis understood now that presence wasn't about availability on demand. It was about recognizing when your absence might matter more than you realize. He didn't become perfect at it. No one does. But he became more honest with himself. And that honesty changed the way he listened, not just to phones, but to people, to pauses, to moments that asked quietly instead of loudly. The call never rang again. That fact remained unchanged. But Elvis learned something lasting from it. That sometimes the most important moments don't announce themselves as important. They sound ordinary. They arrive inconveniently. They ask for more courage than we expect. And when they pass unanswered, they don't disappear. They stay, not to punish, but to teach.